Hello, and this is your instructor Steve Price explaining question number 1 on expansionary monetary policy. And note that it asks you to put LRAS in a position and AD and AS in a position to show a recessionary gap. You're asked also to fill in all of the graphs and the appropriate movements, as well as discuss down below exactly what caused the changes, which determinants were involved, and why things moved and how they moved, and the results from each of the markets above. We start at the far left with the money market. Now first, before we go into the money market, let's remember that we're dealing with the recessionary gap. The recessionary gap is shown on our far right in the SAD model, where we see that Y1 is to the left of YFE. More on that later. In the money market, we have the price of money, which is the interest rate, noted by lowercase I on the y-axis. And we have the quantity of money in supply, or available and demanded, noted on the x-axis by Q sub $sign. We start with a supply curve, S1, that is vertical, showing the amount of money that is in supply, and then a downward sloping demand curve. Now, the vertical supply curve is vertical because this is controlled by the Fed. The Federal Reserve will not change the money supply based upon interest rates, but recall they'll change the money supply based on their dual mandate as to whether or not they want to fight inflation or fight unemployment. Given the fact we have a recessionary gap and thus a recession, they are fighting unemployment. We have a downward sloping demand curve that shows for you and I the demand for money is such that at high interest rates we'll demand few dollars because we'll want our dollars in savings accounts earning high interest rates. Whereas if those interest rates were low, we'd demand more money because we'd have a lower opportunity cost in holding cash, and thus the demand curve is downward sloping. Where they intersect, we see the equilibrium interest rate, lowercase I sub 1. Now, in order to increase the supply of money, as detailed down below in A in the money market, they will decrease the reserve requirement, meaning banks won't have to keep as much money in reserve, and they'll be able to loan out more money, increasing the supply of money. They can also lower the discount and or federal funds rate, the discount rate being the rate that banks pay to borrow directly from the Fed, the federal funds rate being the rate that banks charge one another from borrowing from each other. Remember, it's a little counterintuitive. The federal funds is not borrowing from the Fed, but it is borrowing from other banks. The discount rate is borrowing directly from the Fed. The Fed can also buy bonds, in this case buying something from the public and giving them cash in exchange, and all of these things together increase the money supply. This is shown by our new S2 curve, showing an increase in the supply of money, which as we move along the downward sloping demand curve results in a lower equilibrium interest rate, or as economists put it, there is downward pressure on interest rates. Continuing, we move to the loanable funds market. There is the amount of funds that are supplied by banks and the demand by banks and individuals for loans. Here we're simplifying it and saying that these loans are simply for investment spending, while you and I know that sometimes people take out loans for frivolous things like vacations. But we're simplifying and saying that in this case this is loanable funds for investment spending, that is private businesses investing in themselves. We have on our y-axis, again, interest rates. We have on our x-axis the amount of investment. And the equilibrium level of interest rates and investment is shown where our first supply and demand curves labeled S1 and D1 intersect, giving us an interest rate of lowercase I sub 1, giving us the investment level of uppercase I sub 1. With an increase in the money supply, this means that banks have an increase in money available to loan. So the supply of loanable funds increase or shifts out. Note that this shift out causes interest rates to become lower. This then incents businesses to find places to invest that money that they can borrow at lower interest rates that will earn them a higher rate of return. So as those interest rates decrease with the higher supply of money, more businesses are going to find investments that are going to earn them a rate of return higher than that I sub 2 level of interest rates. So we're going to see an increase in private investment. That is, businesses investing in themselves. This is in contrast with the foreign exchange market. Although there are many, many determinants for what shifts the supply and demand curves for foreign exchange of dollars, of every currency, in this class we're simplifying it and saying that only interest rates are a determinant. And they are one of the most powerful determinants. We see on our y-axis ROW, standing for rest of world, over the dollar, meaning it is the rest of the world's value of the dollar. This is a simplified trade-weighted exchange rate, meaning it's an exchange rate that we have relative to the rest of the world, weighted towards those countries that we trade with more. Here, there's an entirely different motivation for foreign investors simply looking for a rate of return. If they see lower interest rates in the United States on simple savings accounts, but this will also translate into lower interest rates on government bonds, on corporate bonds, on various other investment vehicles that earn an interest rate. And if all of these are earning lower interest rates, there's going to be a decrease in the amount of money demanded because foreigners are going to find fewer places to invest their money at higher interest rates, and thus they're going to find other places to invest their money because we have lowered our interest rates. This decreases the demand for dollars. That decrease in demand lowers the price of something, and in this case it's lowering the price of the dollar, and that's known as a depreciation. This depreciation of our currency in turn will increase our net exports by making our exports cheaper to the rest of the world while making imported products more expensive to us. Increasing exports, decreasing imports. Finally, we have, because of lower interest rates, an increase in consumption. Because what we see in the loanable funds market, an increase in investment spending, private business investment. And because of the depreciation of our currency in the foreign exchange market, we see an increase in net exports. All of these combine to shift out the AD curve, since the determinants for AD are consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Government spending will come later. Not on this test, but on the final. So we see in the ASAD model, on our y-axis, the overall price level in our economy. On the x-axis, real GDP. We show an upward sloping AS curve with a flat area showing the Keynesian zone where government policy and government spending can increase the size of our economy. And then it slopes upward through a recovery, then to the classical zone, showing where conservatives are rightly showing that any growth beyond an AD up that area only leads to inflation, and therefore policies that shift out AS, that tend to be those espoused by conservatives, we need to shift out the AS curve. So in fact, both are right. Just depends on which time frame you're looking at. Now we see the AD1 curve intersecting the AS curve towards the origin where there is Y1, our current level of GDP. And we see at the long run aggregate supply where our GDP is at full employment, meaning we're employing all of our resources. And we see there's a gap between them. There's less GDP than what we're capable of at YFE. That is our recessionary gap. Here I'm assuming that the higher levels of consumption, as noted below, investment, and net exports are shifting out AD just enough to perfectly hit LRAS, AS, and thus reaching full employment, while of course leading to price increases, but moderate price increases, as price increases are a result of economic growth.